right, I've got a minute or two after 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get ready to dive in. For folks that I don't know, I am Susie Lee. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Strategy and Engagement at Forefront. And I'm here today to help launch our Ask a Consultant program. This program actually came out of a partnership between the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits and Forefront right around the start of the pandemic. There were conversations beforehand about having actual live in-person programs, which for obvious reasons didn't happen. But when we knew that the community on all sides really needed information really fast, this was a program that came out of that. And then as time went on and our hopes of the pandemic passing quickly faded, we decided to keep this going because one of the things that a lot of us noticed people were really missing, besides, hugs and going out for drinks with friends and all that good stuff, was the types of just casual connections that we used to be able to make at luncheons and meetings and all the things we used to do in the real world. So we've kept Ask a Consultant going as a way to bring important conversations to our community and also to provide this space just for those conversations to happen. So today's program is technically a part 2, although if you missed part 1, you'll be just fine. So we're talking about data collection and storytelling. Part 1 was really focused on internal work, like program evaluation and metrics. If you missed it and you do want to see that, you can find the recording in the notes on our site. And then today's focus is really on external work. A couple of housekeeping notes before we dive into the program. We are recording so that folks can look back and see if you missed something or a slide you want to look at. We'll also have notes from the program with the highlights of the conversation. So again, you can take a look at it yourself, you can refer a friend. And then, well, the first part of our program will be dedicated to sort of a curated conversation. We definitely want folks to feel like they can ask questions and make this a conversation. So feel free to enter questions into the chat at any time, and then we always reserve sort of the last 30 minutes or so of the program so that folks can jump on. If you want to speak your question into the room, we invite you to do so. And if you'd rather just type it, that's totally fine too, whatever makes you most comfortable. Now, typically, I would like to introduce our entire panel, but to be perfectly honest, my brain doesn't seem to hold that much information anymore. So I'm just going to start by introducing my friend, Anita Banerjee. She is our moderator for today. She was the director of the Democracy Initiative at Forefront. And when we were thinking about this program, particularly talking about data and storytelling and external audiences, I thought about the great work she did, especially around the census, which had just mind-boggling amounts of data and really important stories to tell, and she did it beautifully. So Anita, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susie. You were too kind. It is so wonderful to be back with the Forefront family today. I'm wearing my former director of the Democracy Initiative hat, and I will be today's moderator. Really excited to dive into data and storytelling. We've got some really esteemed panelists that will be sharing some great advice and guidance for all of you today. As Susie mentioned, I had the opportunity to lead the Illinois Count Me In 2020 program, and that really entailed collecting data in real time and then being able to share it for very specific storytelling purposes. It was an incredible feat, and it taught me a lot about the connections of data and storytelling. And so I am here today to help assist with the program through moderation, and will help Susie with the Q&A at the end of the program. But I'd like to take a minute now and turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves, and then also to give definitions of what does data mean to you, and what does storytelling mean to you, so that it helps frame the conversation that we will delve into a little later in the program. So I'm going to punt it to Gordon if you want to kick us off with introductions and your definitions.
Great. I knew you were going to call on me first. I better unmute. So thank you so much. It's really good to be here. My name is Gordon Mayer. I have my own communications firm, Gordon Mayer Communications. I focus on helping nonprofits and businesses that a lot of times have kind of complex or complicated stories to tell, or that are just really busy and need some help, with somebody who can actually focus on helping them get that part of the work done. And what I work with organizations to do is to share their work and their impact with the people that they care about, which might be like your base and your customers, your funders, your partners, could be your mom, whoever doesn't quite understand why the work you're doing is super urgent. I also am a coach for something called Living Proof Advocacy, which is a personal storytelling for advocates. And I'm so great that I get to kind of kick off these definitions. I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to say that we have numbers and we have people. And I, just to sort of, I think about story and people and person as kind of like a data point that you can use to give people a feel for your work and sort of make a lot of our organizations do things that are not super concrete. So both one key number, when we can talk about how many numbers makes data, or one key story can really help kind of give people a feel for the work you do. And I will pass it. Am I passing? Great. I'll pass it to Amelia.
Thank you, Gordon. Hello, everyone. My name is Amelia Kam. I'm with Data Viz for nonprofits, so I visualize data. I have more than 25 years experience studying, funding, and evaluating human services, primarily as a researcher at Chapin Hall, which is a child policy center at the University of Chicago. And at Chapin Hall, I worked with organizations and their data all the time. And I came to know the difficulties that many organizations face in using data well. I just felt that there had to be a better way for organizations without high-level data analysis skills in-house to extract meaning quickly and painlessly from their data and to put it to work for them. So that's when I got interested in data visualization, or data viz for short. Human superpower really is visual analysis. Our brains have been wired over millions of years to be able to detect things like color, shape, and size at lightning speed. It's really helped us to survive. It helps us for most of human history to see predators at a distance hiding behind tall grasses. But it really serves us today as well, because we cannot process words and numbers at lightning speed. Maybe sometime off thousands of years from now, our brains will have evolved to do that, but we're not there yet. So we often gaze at the sight of data in the form of a spreadsheet and just zone out. Data visualization encodes data in visual formats such as color and shape, rather than in words and numbers, and thus allows us to extract meaning from the data much more quickly. So again, I now help nonprofits, consultants, and foundations to visualize their data through my consulting business called Data Viz for Nonprofits. So, okay, so now on to my definitions. I really appreciated Gordon's of data and data storytelling. So I'm a researcher, so I define data as information, especially facts and numbers collected to be examined and considered and used for decision making. So of course there's raw data, meaning data that hasn't been analyzed, and raw data usually has very little meaning. Data analysis is the process of systematically reducing data in order to derive insights. So data can be reduced, for example, by summarizing. We can take an average of numerical data, or we can categorize units into groups, such as coding textual data into themes. It's really important to remember that not all data is created equal. High quality data is more complete, it's in a consistent and usable format, it's up to date, and if it's a sample of a larger data set, it's representative of that larger set. Okay, so now on to data storytelling. So data storytelling often refers to using a combination of narrative, images, and data to make things quote unquote clear. And when I first came across that term, data storytelling, it instantly appealed to me. So data suggests, of course, right, credibility, information that has some objective basis to it. But data to many of us is, right, it's boring. So its meaning is often uncertain and unclear to us. Storytelling, by contrast, suggests clarity, a plot with both excitement and resolution. So by coupling these two words, we seem to get the best of both worlds, right? So data lend credibility to stories, and stories lend excitement and clarity to data. But here's my caution to you all. Stories are not about telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And we should keep this in mind when telling and listening to data stories. To serve their purpose, stories leave out a lot of data, particularly data that doesn't fit the story arc. So for example, you might not hear about a subgroup whose storyline is quite different from the majority. Or you might, indeed, the story might focus exclusively on a subgroup, ignoring the truths of the larger group. So there's rarely one story behind data, and I think we always need to keep that in mind. Okay, enough. I will pass it off to Mindy.
Actually, if we could go to Lauren next.
Oh, sorry.
And then we'll end with Mindy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lauren Reedy, and I am the owner and principal storyteller at Forever Ready Productions. We are a video production company that serves nonprofits. We make video accessible to nonprofits, help fit within budgets. We also do live streaming and have done a lot of that in the last year. But I have a past career of TV journalist. I like to say that I'm a recovering TV journalist. So you want to talk about data. Every night for the 5, 6, or 10 o'clock newscast, I had to take some form of data and put it into a 1-minute news story that explained enough to inform the public. And what I found over that time is that oftentimes there's much more to the story than just what you see in the headlines. And so a lot of our focus is on telling the untold stories behind data, zooming right into something and talking about one person who's impacted by the work or one person who can be a piece of the data. What I like to do is think about it as the head and the heart. Some people, especially donors, if we're talking nonprofits, think very much with their head. They want to know the data. They want to know how many people you've served, how much it costs, how their money is used. And some people, like myself, really enjoy feeling connected and feeling the heart of the story. And then there's also people that are in the middle. And so the challenge that I will bring to today's discussion is how do we take those really complex data sets and break it down to something that somebody can relate to if they're not a numbers person. I think that piece is really important. I also think, having been a journalist, you can take data and make it say whatever you want it to say. And I think that's an interesting piece that might even be a whole other rabbit hole in a discussion today. But I think we have to be careful with data and making sure that we're not bending it too far one way or the other. And my definition of data storytelling is the same as my definition of video storytelling. And that is every piece of data typically starts with a person. And so when I tell a story and when my team tells a story, we start with the person, we weave the facts and some of the data within that story, and we end with the person, because those are the things that relate people back to our mission and our work, specifically when we're talking about nonprofits. So that's a little bit about me. Looking forward to today. I guess it's Mindy's turn.
I'm going to share some slides if that's okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Mindy Faber. I'm the Executive Director of Convergence Design Lab, and we are a 100% woman-owned research and learning design agency that's kind of specializes in the intersections of research and strategic consulting and learning design experience. So mostly we work with learning organizations. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. A lot of youth development organizations and schools. And also I happen to believe nonprofits are all learning organizations that are always engaged in kind of continuous learning. So let's see, I kind of maybe am coming at this a little bit through the lens of our clients, you know, trying to help the clients that we work with to really get at what is the framing of what the story is that they need to tell to counter some of the false narratives that they are often up against in an inequitable and unjust society, right? So kind of like this more conceptual view of it. Starting with data, I think one of the things that we really think about is like, at least I think about this a lot, is like, what counts as data? I think that we often have this really narrow view of what data is, and it kind of turns people off and say, well, I'm not a data scientist, so I don't have accessibility to that. And we think of data in this really kind of broad way, and about the story that kind of communicates. It can potentially communicate about the culture of an organization. We think of experiences that young people have in programs as a form of data. And I think what we're always trying to ask ourselves when we're engaging with our clients is not what is data per se, but what is quality data? What is meaningful and authentic data? What is the kind of information that we can gather that actually leads to real insight? And I think also, this is a really important piece of what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is like, to what extent are you capturing the perspectives and experiences of those most impacted by the work you're doing? Are you being culturally responsive? Are you being asset-based? And just like this visual example next to this image is, you know, like we work with an organization called Spy Hub, a youth media organization in Utah that you'll hear more about. And we wanted to capture kind of the personality, the culture of the organization. So we decided to do an infographic that talks about the mentors' favorite snacks: dried mangoes, carrots, nuts, and bubbly water. Of average cups of coffee that are consumed by mentors in one day, and kind of juxtapose that with some of the hard facts and data that people are used to: the number of community partners, the audience members directly engaged by the program, the number of youth served in the program. So in terms of storytelling, I think of it a little bit differently in some ways. I mean, I also was a video maker, a media artist, before I became an educator and a researcher. So I definitely have that kind of DNA of storytelling in my history. And I know what it means to kind of edit the information in a very kind of intentional way. So I really think about storytelling as a methodology for framing, or in some cases, reframing a narrative that connects to your audience and has the power to influence people's understanding. And I want to talk about meaning making, like the way in which I think before we even start to tell a story, we have to create a frame. And the frame is what guides everything else. And so I believe that framing, good storytelling frames, are a very strategic and important way for nonprofit organizations and foundations to connect dots and to make meaning for their audiences. And those dots that are being connected are between sort of this larger context of social issues, the larger context of your community, the problem, the challenge, right? How do you take that challenge that people understand and connect it to what the organization is doing, their strategies and goals, and then tell the story of the impact? So it's hard. It's hard work to frame. I think framing is actually the hardest part of it to do. And so that's part of what we do, is help organizations figure out their frames.
Wonderful. Mindy, is it okay if we get started with the set of questions?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we've got 4 different topics of questions that we're going to try and get through for the curated section. The first one is types of data. So Mindy, you're up with the first question. How do we include our community in determining what data is important to collect, since it is their stories that we are trying to tell?
Yeah, and I absolutely love this question. I think by including the community, to me, that's like the most, we specialize in participatory action research. So this is really proven to be incredibly important. What we see over and over again is that when you involve the community in the process of data collection, research, evaluation, storytelling, you're going to get deeper insights, more authentic and compelling data, and you're going to build ownership and agency among your community. They're going to become more invested. So we see it as incredibly important. So I want to give a couple of examples of how this looks for us. So we specialize in research, in participatory research, and we often involve the staff and maybe the teaching artist, the audiences, lots of different people in the process. And it often begins, evaluation and research and data collection begins with a research question. So very few times do we actually ask the participants in a program to look at a research question or to help formulate a research question. So a quick example of this comes from our work with Free Spirit Media, where we were asked to come in by Free Spirit Media and help them do some research around a program called The Real Shy. And we always start with a research question. But rather than just assuming that they liked our research question, we went in and talked to the actual youth participants in the program and had them tear our research question apart, criticize it, break it down, parse it out. And so what this is kind of a visual representation of is like wherever there's a crossed out word, that was a word of ours that they said, no, we don't like that word. We want the word elements here. They told us to change it to community newsroom model. That was something that came from them, from our original. But the really important part of this particular example is our research question left out public voice and career paths. By engaging the young people and the teaching artist and the staff in this process, we were able to zero in on what they really wanted us to study, which was this idea of public voice and career paths. They also wanted them to be identified as emerging creators and journalists. Well, this just led to a whole different kind of much more authentic form of data collection by involving the youth. And then another example that I just want to kind of lead you through is we often use, well, I think it's really important to try and make the process of engaging community as playful and approachable, low barrier as possible. So in this example, we were asked to create a theory of action and logic model for SpyHop's new youth and care programs. And what we decided to do was come in and create a game called Theory of Action Mad Libs. What we did was use, because we couldn't do it in person, we used a digital whiteboard to do this. Even though this looks complicated, and we just want to say it's super simple. Just having some simple prompts to engage your community in a kind of active, hands-on ideation and exchange process does wonders. The simple prompts are things like this. What does success look like for you? Tell us your success stories. Having everybody put them on Post-its, group them together, kind of see what the commonalities and themes are that are emerging in that process. How do you know when things are going well, right? How do you see it through your eyes? We get insight, so much more insight when we're asking those types of questions of the people who are directly impacted in the work. Another question we asked, what are the inputs? Like, well, yeah, we understand what success looks like, but what's making it successful? What are the components? What are the essential ingredients? This success wouldn't happen unless this was there. And then having them group those into these categories. It's a really powerful process, very engaging. People are really active in it. That can lead to connecting, helping them make sense of it. Okay, well, we have these outcomes and we have these inputs. What is the linkage? How are these things connecting? And through that process, we were able to actually use the Mad Libs format to help them create their own theory of action Mad Lib statements. And here are 2 examples of that. And what's important about this is it's in their own language. We're not putting our language on them. We're not putting the organizational framework on them. We're actually asking them to frame it in their own words. And then, like in my final slide here in this section, is this kind of led to what are indicators of success? What data can we collect? This actually spawned the ability to be engaging people in that very collection that you just asked, the person asked about what data can we collect? How can we collect it? They came up with the ideas. They came up with ideas that we never would have come up with because they fit the culture of the organization. And so that's a really good example of how to engage, I think, community members. I'll stop there. I know we went long.
Thank you so much, Mindy. So jumping to the next question. This is a question for Amelia and Lauren, but Amelia will go first. And I believe she will be screen sharing as well. The question is there a particular type of data that is more compelling than others? We know that data speaks to human emotions versus human physical well-being. And data also shows a sharp contrast over time versus current up-to-date data that doesn't always have relevant context. So would love to hear your thoughts, Amelia.
Great. So I'm going to talk about just 2 strategies for making your data more compelling. So the first is called placing the viewer in the viz. So it's a surefire way to engage your donors, staff, board members, and others in your data. You engage them by putting them in it, putting them in the data. So how do you do that? So for example, you can show your viewers how accurate their understanding of an issue is. So here's a visualization I created. It's interactive. I'm showing you a static version of it. So you can see that 8.3% of white non-Hispanic children experience poverty. And then the viewers asked how many Black non-Hispanic children experience poverty in the same time. There's a little slider where they can put in their answer. And then if they scroll over, how did you do at the bottom, they get just a little very simple chart showing them what the data shows, what other people guessed, and the red button shows them what they guess. So they can kind of see how far on or off the mark they are. So it's putting their expectations and guesses into the data, and it can be really engaging rather than throwing a whole bunch of statistics at someone. You can also, another strategy is to ask how their habits or lifestyle contribute to or help to reduce a problem. That's another way to put the viewer in the viz. So check out this carbon footprint calculator. It's a great example. You can put in a bunch of data about your own lifestyles in terms of your home, the energy you use in your home, the types of food you eat, your grocery shopping habits, and then it gives you an output in terms of your carbon footprint, and you can compare that to others as well. So it's a really great way to engage someone in an issue like this. Another way is to show the viewer what category they fit into. We all love to find out what group we belong to, right? So think of Harry Potter's sorting hat. Consider elucidating an issue by showing viewers where they fall in relationship to an issue. So that's what I did with this quote unquote data personality viz. Again, this is interactive. So you answer those 2 questions at the top, and then that orange circle puts you in one of 4 categories. And then if you scroll over it, it tells you more about what it means to be intimidated by data, for example. So it's another great way to put the viewer in the viz. Another strategy is to show the people behind, oh my God, sorry about that typo. Obviously, I just did this slide, but show the people behind the data. So data visualizations can provide something that photos and case studies for all their visual appeal cannot. And the thing that it provides is context. So charts, maps, and graphs give us the critical context that we can't see in a photo or a story about one person, such as how prevalent a problem is, where it's occurring, or the impact of a program over time. Data visualizations, of course, also have a downside. A chart, a map, or a graph is an abstraction that aggregates the stories of many individuals. So can we have the best of both worlds is the question. And we can if we put photos and other information about real people into our data visualizations. Consider one of these 2 strategies. You can explain an issue, a problem, or a situation through the stories of select individuals. So this example explains the situation of Somali refugees through the stories of just 2 Somali women, Ayan and Shamshi, in a series of visualizations entitled 2 Years Late. The visualizer in this case labels particular data points to show where these 2 women fit into a larger picture, and then kind of leads you through the issue in terms of the stories of these 2 individual women who kind of represent 2 groups. So the group that came over in 1 year, and then a group that came over that weren't allowed to come over 2 years later. And I'll just leave you with one other strategy about showing the people behind the data points. So another approach is to make each mark. So when we talk about marks in data visualization, those are the dots, the squares, the bars that represent the data. So make each mark represent an actual individual person and allow the viewer to scroll over marks to learn more about these individuals. And this is what the data visualizer, her name is Eve Thompson's strategy is in Stop and Search, which shows the disproportionate rate at which Black people are stopped and searched in London. So each one of those purple dots is an individual. And if you scroll over it, you can see, you can find out more about that individual, but you also have the context, right, to see how that individual compares to the others in the data set. Okay, so that's it for me for this answer.
Thank you so much, Amelia.
Sure.
I love the statistics and the graphs. That was really great. So same question for Lauren. Is there a particular type of data that is more compelling than others?
So that's, first off, I love seeing all that. I could spend hours on those interactive tools and then find a bunch of stories that I think should be told from those. What I wanted to mention about this particular question is keeping dignity at the forefront of any data, anything that you use, no matter how you tell it. We live in a sensational world. If you clicked on any news article today, you probably clicked on it because of the headline. And if you didn't read past the headline, you may not have learned the context. And so I think it's really important, no matter what the data is, to make sure that when people help us tell the story of data, because it's their lived experience or they've been impacted by the work, we have to make sure not to over sensationalize, over dramatize with actors that might act out what they're talking about. That always triggers me a little bit. Forcing sound bites. So obviously I'm the video person here. So if I hear someone say something, I want it to be their words. I don't want to say it like this, because say it like this isn't their words. I think there's a difference between sort of coaching someone and literally feeding them a line. And then I think we also have to recognize our own bias in how we interpret data, both in our organizations and as storytellers for other organizations. how we see the data may not be how the person who supplied it to us sees it. I think Mindy brought that up, in how their words became a totally different story than perhaps what her team would have done. And so we have to recognize that even though we have all the information in front of us, we may not be interpreting it the same way that the folks who gave the data to us in the first place experienced it themselves. So I just wanted to add that piece of it, of remembering that there's more and that we need to keep dignity at the front of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. So this next question is actually a favorite of mine. I have been doing much of my work, my professional work in the advocacy and policy space, and using data for storytelling purposes has always been a bit of a challenge. So this question is for Gordon. Do you have any advice on how advocacy and capacity building organizations can use data to track and report on their work?
Thank you. So I feel like we already have like enough content that we could just unpack the things that we've already talked about. But this also, Anita, I would invite you, if you have thoughts after I've responded, to jump in as well. I also have spent a lot of time on this particular specific question. I worked for many years at a communications capacity building organization. And we struggled with this, and it was a kind of an existential question for the organization, because at the time, funders were asking, well, how do you know you're doing a good job? And so, and we did, at that time, what the organization did, they had kind of down to a science, the personal story part, where every year they would interview 3 people who had been through their workshops, and then they would use that. It was kind of marketing material, and it was kind of something they used to demonstrate how they did what they did. But it didn't tell people very much about how well they did it. And so I think this is a great opportunity to put into practice some of the things that Lauren, Amelia, and Mindy have already talked about, right? And I'm not going to get everything, because I'm really still thinking about if we don't fake the funk, then we expect mentors to have legitimacy, logic model in plain language that Mindy cited. So, but I do think there are a couple of things that you can do that kind of take some of these principles and put them into practice. So an example would be make it concrete. Stories and to go back to the definition, people and numbers, so data, right? In a lot of ways, you're the bridge between the people you're working with, the people that you're, what do you want to say, doing stuff with, and also audiences that you're telling about this work. And whatever kind of storytelling you're doing, whether it's pulling together numbers, data processing, to use Amelia's term, or interviewing people. And I totally, Lauren, hope that you're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of zooming in and zooming out. And I just want to say, you don't have to think of yourself as a novelist or a writer in this storytelling process. You're better off thinking of yourself as a movie director or a movie producer, in terms of how you're telling these stories for your audiences. But really, our job is to use whatever this information is we're gathering for a specific purpose. We can come back around to that in a second, but really to highlight and illustrate, what are you doing? Why does it matter? There's sort of an implicit call to action in that, right? And I think everybody, I know because we talked about this, we pre-met, of course, we're practicing thanks to the folks from Forefront and ACN. And one of the things we talked about is implicit in any kind of storytelling, there's some reason that you're doing it, right? Where Lauren was talking about, as a journalist in the past, she would be telling stories, and probably the implicit reason as a journalist for telling those stories was to get more people to watch, right? I mean, it's a profit situation. Most of our organizations are, in a mission-driven kind of a context. So we're really using this data and telling these stories to advance our mission, or of course, to strengthen our organization. So that's really where you start from. And I guess really the short answer to the, how do you measure advocacy or capacity building question is flip it on its head. What are you trying to do? And then what kind of data will measure that? So just to go back to Mindy's example, because it was particularly compelling, Can you talk to the people that you are working with? Can you talk to legislators, for example? You know, if you're an advocacy organization, or some of the folks, like, what are people saying about your organization? And I guess the last thing I would say about this, before we kind of move on, and I know we're going to have more general conversation, is how do I want to say it? I think you may not convince everybody the first time you tell your story. And it may not be the story that you tell so much as the stories that your audiences are telling themselves that's getting in the way. So it might not be about you. And I guess I want to make this a little bit simpler for folks and not make it harder. You don't have to have a million data points. You don't have to have a million stories. If you have one good story or one good number, or better yet, one of each, that might be really all you need. And you might not even tell it that well the first time, but the more times you work with that information, the better you're going to get. So I guess that would be the last piece of information I would encourage folks to really think about, is try to come up with one good piece. And I guess I would just say, I write a lot of news releases right now, it seems like, and a lot of times that's exactly the package that I put together. It's one number. I'm working with a food pantry, Common Pantry on the north side. They just bought their own building, and they just announced it at the beginning of the week, and they had a great story on Fox News. And one of the pieces that Fox cited was just said exactly, one of the numbers that we put into their story, the data was last year during the pandemic, previous to the pandemic, they fed 350 families a month. During the pandemic, they doubled that to more than 700 families a month. And so that was one number. And one of the things that we haven't done with them, but we'll probably do next, is to start to work with them on some stories and to amplify some of the voices of the folks that they call their guests.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gordon. So now we're going to head on to our next topic of questions, is collecting data. So this question is from Mindy. What are some best practices in collecting student level qualitative data?
Great. And this question was kind of specific in a couple of ways, and I might want to try and broaden it because it's asking about student level data. And that's perfect for me because we primarily work with learning organizations. But I also think that some of these principles that we use are applicable to all kinds of nonprofits. So let's see. Get this. I'm a slide person. Oops. I did the wrong thing though. Okay. Am I good? Okay. So I want to just talk about this was a really hard question, first of all, because there's so many best practices in some ways, and yet there's so few. There's a lot of practices that that are very commonly used that I wouldn't call best practices. But I think that I want to kind of talk about these three things because I have the most experience with them. And I also feel like there's an equity lens that we need to be applying to our work and questioning our kind of previously held assumptions about what makes good student level data collection. So I want to show a couple of examples of this. So the first kind of bullet point I would say is sort of like a principle or best practice might be to really think about like how might we empower students to author and curate their own growth story, or how to build their own growth portfolio, how to make their skills transparent to themselves and to their community. And often that never happens. Students are assessed, we all look at what they're doing, but we don't engage them in asking them, what are you learning? How do you know? What's evidence of what you're doing? So here's a couple of examples of how you might be able to do that. Like a really, really simple exercise is to engage young people in telling their pathway through, if they're working in a youth development nonprofit organization, taking workshops, for instance, maybe you ask them to kind of chart their path. How did you find out about the program? What did you do in the program? What are the moments and experiences that stand out? Why do they stand out? What did you learn from doing that? What did that lead to? Chart your pathway. Where did it take you? Were opportunities unlocked because you gained these skills? Who did you connect to, right? Asking those questions and then having them draw these stories out in terms of personal pathways is amazing evidence of growth, which is often what we're really trying to measure, is like the growth story. The second example is kind of a horrible slide, but it's just like pulled from Chicago LRNG, digital badges. I'm sure a lot of us have heard about digital badges, but ways to kind of capture learning and be able to put it into your portfolio, into your LinkedIn, to actually have evidence that backs up these badges that you've earned around financial literacy, that sort of thing. So making, again, young people curators of their own experience and their own growth, and being able to share that out with future employers, with funders, with their parents, with their teachers, right? Because learning happens everywhere. This next example is also about kind of, I think a lot of times what we do with young people, with participants, and I'm not saying that this is bad because we do it all the time, but we often ask them through survey questions and through focus groups and interviews. There's nothing wrong with that, but what we're getting from that is direct self-reporting. And self-reporting can have its place, especially if it's triangulated with other data points, right? So you have 3 things that you're looking at instead of just 1. But when we first worked with SpyHop, that's all they were doing was doing this exit survey, and every single student gave them 100%. And you could kind of tell they weren't really answering the questions. They were just kind of like giving them a 10 on everything. And so we were like, well, let's look at what are the skills and competencies that young people are actually gaining in the program. Let's actually measure those skills. What can they do? What can they make? How do we assess that? So we created a rubric, and now all the teaching artists use this rubric to assess student work. And then we were able to turn that into this beautiful infographic that reports out, like, look at the competencies that young people are gaining in this program and look at what we're measuring. Like, we're measuring authentic voice. Who measures that, right? That's an important thing to do. And to communicate to their constituencies. And the last example is probably the most difficult in a way for many organizations to do, but I also think it yields the most powerful results. How can you capture student experience? Not just what they say, not just what they can do and make, but what is their experience like in the program? How are they interacting with their teaching artists? Or their teachers or instructors? Or how are they showing that they have agency in the program? Can you observe that? Can you see that? And we often look at things that most people aren't used to looking at, like the embodied experience. We were asked, this particular program where this picture is from was in a very small remote community in southern Utah, where they came in, SpyHop would come in for 1 week. This is a program funded by MacArthur Foundation called Voices of the West. 1 week intensive. These teaching artists that are all from Salt Lake City. They're from a more liberal part of the state, going into these rural and native areas of the state to teach them media production. And so what we were really interested in doing is observing, having an embedded researcher, ethnographer, working in a real life environment on a daily basis, not just one fly in, fly out, every day, 5 days a week from 9 to 5 while they were doing that program. And to really engage with the mentors and with the young people directly, have conversations with them, pull out video cameras, record, photograph, and look and see what's going on. And from that, we generated findings that showed that some very powerful results. And I'll just quickly say, this yielded this major finding that Spy Hop mentors stand behind youth. Now I'm going to botch it, forget it. But it was the idea that the young people were experts of their geography. That came up over and over again. And the teaching artists were experts of the medium. And that created reciprocity in a relationship that yielded a really powerful kind of impact. And we wanted to tell that story to MacArthur Foundation, and they were really interested in that finding.
That was a really great example of the ethnographic experience. So thank you for sharing that. So this next question is for Amelia. What are some tips for getting buy-in from program folks about collecting more and effective data?
Okay, so I'm gonna first answer that question with 4 words, and then I'll expand on it a little bit. My short answer is show them the data. So what do I mean by that? So often staff members are putting data kind of into a black hole. They're doing lots of data entry because it's required of them, and then they never see the benefit on the other end. It kind of just goes into the hole and never comes out as far as they're concerned. So show them a simple chart representing data in your database, particularly that they've entered, and ask them questions like, if anything doesn't look right about the data to them, or any of the results, for example, trends different from what they expected. Why might they be different? Is any data missing? What groups might be missing from the data and why? And what are you not seeing that you would like to see in the data? So all of that can get at improving the quality of your data and improving the types of data that you collect. Also have them add milestones to trends. So if you just do a simple trend line over time, you can use it, if you're doing it virtually, you can just use a whiteboard. If it's in person, you can use Post-it notes and have them literally add significant events, like we got this grant or we moved to locations or something at different time periods on the trend line, and it will help you to start understanding what's driving the trends. That also will engage them in the data and help them to understand the importance of the data and how they, by consuming the data, can help the organization to interpret it. You also might try showing them their own results or results from particular programs that they work on and compare it to the organization as a whole or to other organizations. Again, putting the data in context. This type of engagement will get you on the road to collecting more meaningful and accurate data. I also just want to show an example of a way of engaging staff members in data. So I'm going to share my screen. Just a second. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Oops, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. What are you guys seeing? Engaged staff, or are you seeing a logic model?
Both.
Did you see a Henderson School?
Oh, good. That's what I want you to see. Okay, cool. So this is what I call a living logic model. So Mindy talked about the process of creating a logic model with a lot of input from participants. And in my experience, logic models get tons of play during program development and sort of proposal writing. Tons of staff hours go into creating logic models. And then in my experience, they often collect dust after that when the programs really start getting going. And we have this sort of theory of change, right, about what's supposed to happen and what the interim and long-term impact is supposed to be. But we rarely check to see if our theory is correct. So I wondered, what would happen if you plug a logic model into real-time data? That would be a great way of feeding data back to staff and board members to understand what's really going on. Is the logic model playing out the way we hoped it would? So here's just a very simple example. You see the logic model on top, but I use color gradations to show progress. So darker shades show where there have been more progress, and lighter shades show where there have been less progress. And if you scroll over any particular component, you can learn more about that component of the program. So it's a great way to sort of further explain your theory of change. But the really cool thing is that you can click on any component. I'm going to click on study skills, and you can see you get a different chart depending on which component you click at the bottom that shows you disaggregated data. So not only do you see that we're kind of doing okay in terms of study skills, you can see how each individual student in the tutoring program is doing, which students are above average, which are below, and what are sort of the average across students. So it's just a really simple example. I've done much more complicated ones of plugging data into a visualization that's interactive and can really show you where are you at this point in time in relationship to your plan.
Great, thank you so much, Amelia. So now we're going to go on to the third topic of questions. And this topic is storytelling for specific audiences or for specific impact. And this question is for Lauren. We've often heard that focusing on the big picture, big numbers that speak to a severity of a problem, can often lead to fewer donations. Can you speak to this and whether this has been your experience or not?
Yes, and I believe that I've got a screen share going now. Hopefully you can see this. The short answer is yes, but the complicated answer is it depends who your audience is. So what I'm going to do is share some examples. If you are a data person, which I imagine you're here for that reason, some of this stuff might get you really excited. I get lost in it. So I'm always like, how do we zoom in? So this is a program with the local level 1 trauma center, and you're going to see some data that doesn't match. I'm showing you on the right side of your screen sort of what they did graphically 2 years ago to showcase their impact. Essentially, they help folks who come through the emergency department regularly and are using that as a primary care doctor. They track that and then figure out what the root of that problem is and help connect people with resources to find housing, things like that. Amazing, complex program. Really amazing data came out of their first year, and they put together this infographic. There's a lot there. This on the left side is the updated numbers from 2020 pre-pandemic. All of this stuff is really cool. This is the one piece that I care about the most. They have cared for more than 430 people through this program. Every story is unique. Every story is a little different. The complexities of all these numbers are really cool if you want to like dig in and define what the word graduated means and talk about how much cost is avoided. All that stuff is cool. But what we did is we dove into 1 or 2 patients. So we told the story of Ariel, who was came into the emergency department for a traumatic crash, found herself homeless, found herself continuing to come back to the emergency department for all kinds of health issues. And she got connected with the One Health program, and we captured her moving into her apartment after being homeless. And that really honed in one example of how this program works. And then we told the story of Dell, who had some really bad back pain, like debilitating back pain, was working at the local, one of the FedEx hubs here, lifting packages and things, and he couldn't work. He hurt his back. Well, it turns out he hurt his back because he couldn't afford pain medication, and he couldn't treat his pain. And so they helped connect him, they helped him safely do that. And we told the story of all of these numbers in about a 10-minute documentary, which you'll get a link to after this. I don't want to show it, it won't play well here, but it explains the program and it shows the story of 2 people instead of 430 or 224. And I think this had more impact for people to understand exactly what's being done and how unique each case is. Another example I want to show you is this. This is a homeless shelter here in Memphis. They keep homeless families together. It's one of the only places where teenage boys can stay with their family and don't get separated. You can see here, we've got 2 sets of data. You've got the full operation budget data, which is everything. And then you've got the program data, which is what grants and foundations want to see. And there's a lot of numbers on the screen, right? They've helped 162 families. This is from 2019, 17 families total, all those children. You can see the average cost per family varies depending on how you calculate it. It's a lot of really cool impact. Might be good infographics for social media. How do you tell this in an emotional way? Well, what we did is we zoomed in on, well, first off, I wanted to show you this visual because these are folks that are have been impacted by the program over the course of the last 15 years. So there's a photo of every family on the wall. And we zoomed in and told the photo of one person. And this is Cheryl. She became homeless because of the pandemic, because her kids were home and she couldn't work. She lost her job. And she lived at the Dorothy Day House for about 6 or 8 months. They helped get her back on her feet, get a full-time job with a living wage pay, and were able to move her into her own housing that she now pays for rent. And she was living out of her car. So we took all of this data here, which is amazing and very impactful, but really hard to unpack. And we turned it into the story of one person. And so I think the reason why I share these, and both of these videos will be sent to y'all for review afterwards, and you'll go, oh my gosh, I want to donate, because what it did is it zoomed in on 1 or 2 people and the impact and their story. We can still supply folks with all of that infographic data, and a lot of people, like my husband, for example, loves to see that stuff because he knows that's how his money would be used or how his donations would be used. But I want to meet the people and I want to see how they're doing. The other piece of that, when you're talking about homelessness, when you're talking about people that have any sort of medical issue that brings them into the emergency department, is making sure that they're comfortable with that story and that you don't sensationalize it or tell it incorrectly or move sound bites in a way that tells it differently than it is. In homelessness situations, sometimes they fall back into homelessness, no matter how successful. And that's another data point you have to sort of, for the sake of that story, remove. I'm happy to report that all the people in those 3 stories are still working, still living in the housing that they were placed in, and thriving. And so those are cool pieces, but we took one data point and then zoomed in even further on that. And I think those stories, my experience has been those stories have more impact on donors. But one of my favorite parts about those stories is empowering the people in the organization that do the work every day. If there's one thing we've heard a lot lately, it's burnout. Everybody's burnout. Everybody's feeling like they've done so much to survive in the last year. And so to see the story and the impact of their work on someone else played out in that way is also really special. So stories and data aren't just for our donors, aren't just for recruiting volunteers. Sometimes they're for empowering our own people inside the organization to say, wow, what we're doing really matters. And I love coming to do this and I want to do it, more effectively and want to continue marching forward. So those stories, I do encourage you to take the time to watch them when the email gets sent out with links, because they show how we took very complex data and said, all right, let's zoom in and make it about one person.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That piece about burnout resonates quite deeply.
Yes, I think everyone's feeling it for sure.
Yeah. but so important to continue to collect this data, particularly in the midst of the pandemic and how it's relevant to the world post-pandemic. So then last curated question for today's program goes to Gordon. In storytelling, how much detail do you share? How do you decide what details are crucial and those that are not?
Thank you. Awesome. So I guess, the first thing is to think a little bit. This is, again, it's this question about collection, because you can't share stuff you ain't got. And then a question about curation, right? About selection. So in terms of collection, I love, Lauren, I just want to piggyback on what you said and the way you think about kind of the numbers and what you call the zooming in on the stories. When we were pre-meeting, I talked about the idea that you can think about the people part of your storytelling and data sharing as kind of like the spoonful of sugar that makes the numbers go down. So you can think about, as you're sharing your stories, how can I put together, and I use this word, package, how can you package something that has a little bit of both these kind of, I think it might have also been, Lauren, we talked about like a left brain, right brain, like how do you give people the complete package? So that's, I think, important. And I think one of the ways that you do that as you're selecting, and I know this is so hard because I know everybody, I know our culture, we're busy and, people are asking us to do things all the time. And I don't know if we have comms people or directors or board members, but I know everybody's busy, but certainly as a comms person, I know a lot of times you don't even control your own schedule. So, but if you can change the time element and start to think about, well, what am I going to need? Like, okay, my annual report is not going to be until January, but what is the thing that I'm going to tell? Like, what is the data point? It's so great if you can start to think about that. Just give yourself a little time, because you're going to need, whatever it is, you're going to need to collect it. You're going to need to go and ask those people if you can interview them. You may have to ask somebody's permission. We don't really, if there are questions, we can get into some of the details about asking for permission, interviewing people, having them correct, review what you wrote. And usually when I'm doing interviews with people, one of the first things I say is, you're going to see this before anybody else does. So feel comfortable saying whatever you want, just to make sure I didn't make a mistake or say something you didn't like. Like Lauren, I come from journalism, but I think of myself as, like it's journalism in service of a mission. It's kind of how I think about that. So, that's kind of like, there's this question that comes even before the selection. And I talked a little bit about that. But this next piece, in terms of like, how do you use the data once you've got it? I don't know, maybe people have heard this expression, write drunk, edit sober. And I would definitely encourage you to think about, how you collect the data in that way. Like I certainly, and this is partly me, and I do this for a living. I want to know everything. So I'm very curious, and I love to have like way more information than you're going to see in the final piece, right? Because I want to then start, just pick the good stuff, the best stuff. I went to graduate school a few years ago, and one of the preceptors in my program said something that really stuck with me. They said, when you're writing your thesis, when you start deleting stuff or getting, rid of big chunks of information that it really hurts to get rid of because you just love it so much, like you're actually starting to get somewhere. So I definitely think that it's a process of honing, having, a lot of times you have a bunch of information. A bunch of us have talked about thinking about your audiences, thinking about the people that you work with and the people most impacted, and making sure that you're collecting information that really reflects that. And thinking about what you're trying to do, like what your call to action is, what you want people to do with the information. So there's so many things to think about. And honestly, all of those things are going to be furthered if you are able to edit things down and come up with the most compact package that you possibly can. So I guess the short answer would be, come up with a bunch of stuff and then get rid of 95% of it. So let me stop there. I know we have lots of things to say.
So duly noted, write drunk, edit sober.
So, and that's what people will take away, that and the ceiling fan, I think.
I'd like to take a moment now to ask all of the panelists to give a few quick, concise closing remarks and focus your remarks around the question, how do you consistently best use data in storytelling? So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, if you could go first.
First, huh? Well, since I'm the one that does that's a video forward, that's my favorite medium. I think what is most important about all of this is the people that are impacted by it and the people who give us those data points, whether it's tracking how many folks we've helped get out of homelessness or reducing the cost of uninsured in emergency departments or connecting folks with more food security. The people are the center. And when we think of things and we start there, that is how we get the impact of a story that calls people to action and makes folks want to be a part of it, whether that is opening up their pocketbook. Does anybody do that in 2021? Whether that's Venmoing you, whether that's however people donate these days, or it's getting involved and volunteering. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned is that people who support our organizations are storytellers for us as well. And so if they're empowered either from a volunteer experience or from an encounter that they had with someone that we serve, they're going to share our story too. And they're going to be data points for us to track as well. And so I think if we all remember people are the center of this, people are the center of the work we do, that is where we start. And all the rest can be pocketed in all kinds of different ways. You could have 2 years of content from one infographic. And you could share it all and overload people, or you could plan it out and share it in a timely fashion in a relevant way that keeps people at the center. And I think that's where you get the most impact with data.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Amelia, can you share some closing guiding remarks?
Sure, and I think I just want to echo some things that Lauren and Gordon just said. And Gordon talking about the editing process of putting stuff down and then keeping only about 5% made me think of the quotation, which I can't remember who exactly said, but it's perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And I think when creating anything where you want the message to be clear, it's really important that you clear it out so that there's sort of space around the most important data points or the most important message, and everything else is cleared away because they're distractions. So I guess that's what I would like people to take away from this, that if you really want to make an impact with data, really focus on the message and clear the rest away.
Thank you, Amelia.
Sure.
Mindy, how do you consistently best use data in storytelling?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Mindy.
Okay, sorry about that. I guess I want to go back to the idea of framing. I really think that, you know, kind of pulling back and thinking about how do we want to tell this story to drive equity and change in the context that makes sense to these audiences that we're addressing. I think that's a really important process that should be moved to the front, like backwards design, because everything kind of falls from that. And I think it has to be done in the context of thinking about what stories are not told and what narratives are left out. And we are living in such an era of propaganda and disinformation that it's really important that our voices are loud, right? And I agree with a lot of what Gordon has said about repetition and keeping it simple. And I think if you have the frame, then you can tell the same, you can be telling the same framed story over and over again in different ways with different data points, right? And that works.
Can I just thank you, Ed, just to add on to that. One of the things I liked listening to, I've been doing some pitching recently, which I actually don't much like to do. And one of the reasons I think it's really hard is lot of times the stories that we're telling, and this is true for, I'm sure this is true for all or many of the folks on the phone, you may be telling stories that are framed in a different way than most of the people you're telling them to think or believe.
Exactly.
So you're not just, if you think you're having a hard time, it's not you, it's them. So it's just like to recognize that the bar is sometimes set higher in terms of, for our organizations, as we're telling stories or sharing data that maybe, is actually not just asking people to agree with what you're saying, but also maybe the story that's underneath the story that you're telling.
Right.
So just to make your lives a little harder.
That and like switching this, I think it's like flipping the script a lot is a really powerful technique, because I think those dominant narratives are at the forefront of people's mind, and you have to use metaphors to kind of flip the script on people and tell it in a different lens, and that they can connect with, that they have the associations to connect with it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Amelia, Lauren, Gordon, and Mindy, for your expertise, your experience in the field, and of course, your wonderful knowledge and guidance today. I'm sure folks have more questions, so I would like to now turn it back over to Susie to bring us home with the Q&A.
Oh, trying to get off mute. Thanks, Anita. Thank you, all of you. This has been fantastic. I've been furiously taking notes myself. So absolutely, if folks want to, again, if you are comfortable coming on video and speaking a question into the room, we welcome you to do so. If you want to throw it into the chat, that is great as well. My colleague Key also put a couple of upcoming programs that we wanted to share with folks. We've got the Forefront Virtual Summit coming up on June 22nd. And there's also the Asian Americans at the Intersection of History and Racial Equity program coming up. I believe that one is next week. So just wanted to highlight those for folks. Kathy, thank you as always. You're such a great participatory person on these programs. So thanks for the question. Kathy asked us, how legit does data coming from a survey need to be? Is SurveyMonkey a reputable tool?
I mean, I have to admit that when Mindy, you were saying like that you were totally, when you were working with the group in Utah and they were collecting self-reported data, I don't think I did a good job of saying this when I was doing the capacity building work. We totally used self-reported data. I don't know how well we sold people on that, like how persuasive it was to our audiences. So I don't know what how people feel about this.
I would say that absolutely SurveyMonkey is an essential tool, and like I would be lying through my teeth if I said we didn't use it and rely on it. But you can do quantitative and qualitative data collection through SurveyMonkey. You can ask open-ended questions and you can get nuggets of, oh my God, some of the things I've heard kids say in their surveys on SurveyMonkey are incredible. I guess my point is, don't make that your only data point, right? If you really want valid, reputable quality data, you really need to be kind of looking. I think it's good to try and at least have 3 sets of data that you're looking at and that you're analyzing and reflecting on, and really digging deep into it and saying, are these things contradictory? If they're contradictory, then maybe we need to probe a little bit deeper.
I'd like to add to that, I don't think it's the tool that makes the data legitimate. I think it's how you ask your questions, and you can use any tool to do that. When there's a whole science behind collecting survey data, but you're always trying to get after 2 things. You want your data to be reliable. So you want the tool, in this case, a survey instrument, to collect data that gets at what you're trying to understand in a reliable way over time and across respondents. And then you want your data to be valid. So if you're measuring engagement, for example, your questions about engagement really need to get at engagement. And you can look up reliability and validity online to learn more about it, but that's what increases the quality of your data, not the tool you use to collect it. You can also triangulate data, which is what Mindy's talking about, having data from multiple sources. Using only survey data, the thing is you need to have different reporters. So this is what Gordon was getting at. If it's all self-report, then it's not going to be as valid as if you have multiple types of reporters. So if you're collecting data about a program for kids, you might want to collect data from the kids themselves, from staff, from parents, that sort of thing.
And while we're keeping the window open for other questions to come in, I want to build on that a little bit. In my 15 plus years working in nonprofit and volunteer organizations, I've used SurveyMonkey in every single one of them. Are there other tools out there that you all have had experience with, hopefully positive experience with?
Google Forms works well as well.
That's what I was going to say. Google Forms is what a lot of our partners have used.
Do you want tools other than survey collection, or are you just asking sort of in general?
Well, I was thinking mostly on the survey collection front.
Okay.
We were
Yeah,
in
right.
that area.
Yeah, I think Google Forms and SurveyMonkey are honestly, there are, a lot of groups, a lot of times I see organizations work with a consulting firm that does this, that can help them with this work. And then the firm sometimes will bring a different tool to the table. Because there are other alternatives, but yeah, at least SurveyMonkey, so easy.
Awesome, thanks. We've got a couple more questions that came in. One was for other tools beyond survey tools. So maybe if we could throw some of those in the chat, and then for the conversation, we also got a question I've seen many, many times from nonprofits in our membership. How do you get participants interested in being involved in the storytelling, as in getting interviewed and being public with their story? I know a lot of times, especially in human services work, folks are concerned about privacy and what it means to publicly share their story.
I love that question. I think the first thing is to just ask. I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask because of what you just said, Susie. Like, there's a lot of privacy, there's a lot of sensitivity. Not everybody wants to share that they used your services or were impacted by your work, but sometimes all it takes is an ask, and people are so excited. The other part of that I think is worth mentioning is the empowerment behind it. The fact that they may have been waiting for you to ask and wanting to participate. And then the other thing that I would say is it's just like it's not about the tool you use to collect data. It's not about the tool you use to tell the story either. Obviously, I'm going to say, hey, hire a professional. It's so awesome. Capture an interview on a really nice camera, but also you can capture an interview on this camera that's probably attached to your hip. And that's another piece when asking people to tell the story of their experience is like, let them do it. I think I see Mindy nodding her head because they want to participate, and it might be vertical video, which I hate, but it's their perspective. And they then become even more a part of the story. But it starts with a simple ask. And if they say no, don't push it because they don't want to participate. But more often than not, they're very eager to participate.
I totally 100% agree with all of that, because every single, we do focus groups with young people, and the mentors, the staff are always like, I don't know if they'll want to do this. It'll be hard to get them to talk. It's never hard to get teenagers to talk. You put pizza in front of them and you say, we just want to hear what you have to say. The only reason they're dying if they have a good experience, right? You can't get them to shut up. They want to tell you. And I think one important piece of this, though, is not to have the staff in the room, right? Because you do want to create conditions of safety and honesty. And I think you have to think really intentionally about you know, in the context of a focus group, that's something that we're not sharing this information. This is anonymous. We're not attaching names to this. So there's two levels. There's one, getting on the camera and telling the story, but there's also ways to conduct stories in a more private way that are really powerful too.
Awesome, thank you. So we
one more thing, just sorry,
Yeah.
on that topic, pay people.
Mm,
We've had a lot, you know, I mean, I just certainly work with organizations where we're like, that are maybe a little bit on the larger side, and that are doing more formal marketing. We'll do a focus group, we'll certainly pay people for that kind of work. But people, I don't think it's out of the bounds to pay people for their stories and storytelling, depending a little bit, program participants, you know, depending on the organization and their position. That doesn't work for everybody, but can be an option. And, you know, it doesn't have to be break the bank.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Gordon, I really appreciate you saying that. It makes me remember a few years ago when I was working with Feeding America and the Greater Chicago Food Depository on the hunger study, and they paid participants for their time to complete the survey. And it was just a matter of, you know, the way they presented it was everybody's time is valuable and we want to respect that. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Well, and you know, I mean, it's something that drives me a little bit crazy. I'm doing a webinar with the group tomorrow, and we were running around like, how can we do this for free? Like, oh, you know what? It'll cost us $40 to set up, you know, a webinar account just for the month. You know, we could handle the $40. So, but you know, I mean, so I think a lot of times because we're really good about conserving our resources, you know, like we kind of, it's a little bit like it's a limiter that we sometimes put on ourselves, and those small amounts of money can make a big difference for, you know, for our work.
Absolutely. Well, I want to be considerate of everyone's time, and also just, you know, as thankfully we seem to be ending these pandemic days and slowly creeping our way towards being able to actually go out and see each other and chat and have coffees and hug and all that good stuff. So I want to say I really appreciate our panelists being with us today. Anita, thank you so much for moderating fabulously. Thank you for the partnership with the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits. And thank you to all the participants. I know, you know, I'm looking forward to the day that I don't have to spend so many hours on Zoom. So thank you for spending a few minutes with us today. I hope today was useful to everyone in terms of the information that was shared and that you felt a little bit more connected to our community of work. The last thing I'll say is if you want to see this and other programs in the series, check out our page of Ask a Consultant on Forefront's website. With that, have a wonderful day. Enjoy some sunshine, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Bye. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
Thank you.